Chapter 5 of Aesthetic as Science of Expression and General Linguistic. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lisa Reichert. Aesthetic as Science of Expression and General Linguistic by Benedetto Croce, translated by Douglas Ainsley, 1865 to 1948. Chapter 5. Analogous Errors in Historic and Logic. The better to confirm these criticisms, it will be opportune to cast a rapid glance over analogous and opposite errors, born of ignorance as to the true nature of art, and of its relation to history and to science. These errors have injured alike the theory of history and of science, of historic or historiology, and of logic. Critique of the philosophy of history. Historical intellectualism has been the cause of the many researches which have been made, especially during the last 2 centuries, researches which continue today for a philosophy of history, for an ideal history, for a sociology, for a historical psychology, or however may be otherwise entitled or described, a science whose object is to extract from history universal laws and concepts. Of what kind must be these laws, these universals? Historical laws and historical concepts? In that case, an elementary criticism of knowledge suffices to make clear the absurdity of the attempt. When such expressions as a historical law, a historical concept, are not simply metaphors colloquially employed, they are true contradictions in terms. The adjective is as unsuitable to the substantive as is the expressions qualitative quantity or pluralistic monism. History means concretion and individuality, law and concept mean abstraction and universality. If, on the other hand, the attempt to draw from history historical laws and concepts be abandoned, and it be merely desired to draw from it laws and concepts, the attempt is certainly not frivolous, but the science thus obtained will be not a philosophy of history, but rather, according to the case, either philosophy in its various specifications of ethic, logic, etc., or empirical science in its infinite divisions and subdivisions. Thus are sought out either those philosophical concepts which are, as has already been observed, at the bottom of every historical construction, and separate perception from intuition, historical intuition from pure intuition, history from art, or already formed historical intuitions are collected and reduced to types and classes, which is exactly the method of the natural sciences. Great thinkers have sometimes donned the unsuitable cloak of the philosophy of history, and notwithstanding the covering, they have conquered philosophical truths of the greatest magnitude. The cloak has been dropped, the truth has remained. Modern sociologists are rather to be blamed, not so much for the illusion in which they are involved when they talk of an impossible science of sociology, as for the infecundity which almost always accompanies their illusion. It is but a small evil that aesthetic should be termed sociological aesthetic, or logic social logic. The grave evil is that their aesthetic is an old-fashioned expression of sensualism, their logic verbal and incoherent. The philosophical movement, to which we have referred, has borne 2 good fruits in relation to history. First of all has been felt the desire to construct a theory of historiography, that is, to understand the nature and the limits of history, a theory which, in conformity with the analysis made above, cannot obtain satisfaction, save in a general science of intuition, in an aesthetic from which historic would be separated under a special head by means of the intervention of the universals. Furthermore, concrete truths relating to historical events have often been expressed beneath the false and presumptuous cloak of a philosophy of history. Canons and empirical advice have been formulated by no means superfluous to students and critics. It does not seem possible to deny this utility to the most recent of philosophies of history, to so-called historical materialism, which has thrown a very vivid light upon many sides of social life, formerly neglected or ill understood. Aesthetic invasions into logic. The principle of authority, of the ipse dixit, is an invasion of historicity into the domains of science and philosophy which has raged in the schools. This substitutes for introspection and philosophical analyses, this or that evidence, document, or authoritative statement, with which history certainly cannot dispense. But logic, the science of thought and of intellectual knowledge, has suffered the most grave and destructive disturbances and errors of all, through the imperfect understanding of the aesthetic fact. How, indeed, could it be otherwise, if logical activity come after and contain in itself aesthetic activity? An inexact aesthetic must of necessity drag after it an inexact logic. Whoever opens logical treatises, from the Organuum of Aristotle to the moderns, must admit that they all contain a haphazard mixture of verbal facts and facts of thought, of grammatical forms and of conceptual forms, of aesthetic and of logic. Not that attempts have been wanting to escape from verbal expression and to seize thought in its effective nature. Aristotelian logic itself did not become mere syllogistic and verbalism without some stumbling and oscillation. The especially logical problem was often touched upon in the Middle Ages by the nominalists, realists, and conceptualists in their disputes. With Galileo and with Bacon, the natural sciences gave an honourable place to induction. Vico combated formalist and mathematical logic in favour of inventive methods. Kant called attention to a priori synthesis. The absolute idealists despised the Aristotelian logic. The followers of Herbart, bound to Aristotle, on the other hand, set in relief those judgments which they called narrative, which are of a character altogether different from other logical judgments. Finally, the linguists insisted upon the irrationality of the word in relation to the concept. But a conscious, sure, and radical movement of reform can find no base or starting point save in the science of aesthetic. Logic in its essence. In a logic suitably reformed on this basis, it will be fitting to proclaim before all things this truth and to draw from it all its consequences. The logical fact, the only logical fact, is the concept, the universal, the spirit that forms, and in so far as it forms, the universal. And if be understood by induction, as has sometimes been understood, the formation of universals, and by deduction the verbal development of these, then it is clear that true logic can be nothing but inductive logic. But since by the word deduction has been more frequently understood the special processes of mathematics, and by the word induction those of the natural sciences, it will be advisable to avoid the one and the other denomination, and to say that true logic is the logic of the concept. The logic of the concept, adopting a method which is at once induction and deduction, will adopt neither the one nor the other exclusively, that is, will adopt the speculative method, which is intrinsic to it. The concept, the universal, is in itself, abstractly considered, inexpressible. No word is proper to it. So true is this, that the logical concept remains always the same, notwithstanding the variation of verbal forms. In respect to the concept, expression is a simple sign or indication. There must be an expression, it cannot fail. But what it is to be, this or that, is determined by the historical and psychological conditions of the individual who is speaking. The quality of the expression is not deducible from the nature of the concept. there does not exist a true, logical sense of words. He who forms a concept bestows on each occasion their true meaning on the words. Distinction between logical and non-logical judgments. This being established, the only truly logical, that is, aesthetico-logical propositions, the only rigorously logical judgments, can be nothing but those whose proper and exclusive content is the determination of a concept. These propositions or judgments are the definitions. Science itself is nothing but a complex of definitions unified in a supreme definition, a system of concepts or chief concept. It is therefore necessary to exclude from logic all those propositions which do not affirm universals. Narrative judgments, not less than those termed non-enunciative by Aristotle, such as the expression of desires, are not properly logical judgments. They are either purely aesthetic propositions or historical propositions. Peter is passing. It is raining today. I am sleepy. I want to read. These and an infinity of propositions of the same kind are nothing but either a mere enclosing in words the impression of the fact that Peter is passing, of the falling rain, of my organism inclining to sleep, and of my will directed to reading, or they are existential affirmation concerning those facts. They are expressions of the real or of the unreal, of historical or of pure imagination. They are certainly not definitions of universals. Syllogistic. This exclusion cannot meet with great difficulties. It is already almost an accomplished fact, and the only thing required is to render it explicit, decisive, and coherent. But what is to be done with all that part of human experience which is called syllogistic, consisting of judgments and reasonings which are based on concepts? What is syllogistic? Is it to be looked down upon from above with contempt, as something useless, as has so often been done in the reaction of the humanists against scholasticism, in absolute idealism, in the enthusiastic admiration of our times for the methods of observation and experiment of the natural sciences? Syllogistic, reasoning in forma, is not a discovery of truth. It is the art of exposing, debating, disputing with oneself and others. Proceeding from concepts already formed, from facts already observed, and making appeal to the persistence of the true or of thought, such is the meaning of the principle of identity and contradiction, it infers consequences from these data, that is, it represents what has already been discovered. Therefore, if it be an idem per idem, from the point of view of invention, it is most efficacious as a teaching and an exposition. To reduce affirmations to the syllogistic scheme is a way of controlling one's own thought and of criticizing that of others. It is easy to laugh at syllogizers, but if syllogistic has been born and retains its place, it must have good roots of its own. Satire, applied to it, can concern only its abuses, such as the attempt to prove syllogistically questions of fact, observation, and intuition, or the neglect of profound meditation and unprejudiced investigation of problems for syllogistic formality. And if so-called mathematical logic can sometimes aid us in our attempt to remember with ease, to manipulate the results of our own thought, let us welcome this form of the syllogism also, long prophesied by Leibniz and essayed by many, even in our days. But precisely because syllogistic is the art of exposing and of debating, its theory cannot hold the first place in a philosophical logic, usurping that belonging to the doctrine of the concept, which is the central and dominating doctrine, to which is reduced everything logical in syllogistic, without leaving a residuum, relations of concepts, subordination, coordination, identification, and so on. Nor must it ever be forgotten that the concept, the logical judgment, and the syllogism do not occupy the same position. The first alone is the logical fact. The second and third are the forms in which the first manifests itself. These, in so far as they are forms, cannot be examined save aesthetically, grammatically; in so far as they possess logical content, only by neglecting the forms themselves and passing to the doctrine of the concept. False logic and true aesthetic. This shows the truth of the ordinary remark to the effect that he who reasons ill also speaks and writes ill, that exact logical analysis is the basis of good expression. This truth is a tautology, for to reason well is in fact to express oneself well, because the expression is the intuitive possession of one's own logical thought. The principle of contradiction itself is at bottom nothing but the aesthetic principle of coherence. It will be said that starting from erroneous concepts, it is possible to write and to speak exceedingly well, as it is also possible to reason well, that some who are dull at research may yet be most limpid writers. That is precisely because to write well depends upon having a clear intuition of one's own thought, even if it be erroneous. That is to say, not of its scientific, but of its aesthetic truth, since it is this truth itself. A philosopher like Schopenhauer can imagine that art is a representation of the Platonic ideas. This doctrine is absolutely false scientifically, yet he may develop this false knowledge in excellent prose, aesthetically most true. But we have already replied to these objections, when we observed that at that precise point where a speaker or writer enunciates an ill-thought concept, he is at the same time speaking ill and writing ill. He may, however, afterwards recover himself in the many other parts of his thought, which consist of true propositions, not connected with the preceding errors, and lucid expressions may with him follow upon turbid expressions. Logic reformed. All inquiries as to the forms of judgments and of syllogisms, on their conversion and on their various relations, which still encumber treatises on logic, are therefore destined to become less, to be transformed, to be reduced to something else. The doctrine of the concept and of the organism of the concepts, of definition, of system, of philosophy, and of the various sciences and the like, will fill the place of these and will constitute the only true and proper logic. Those who first had some suspicion of the intimate connection between aesthetic and logic, and conceived aesthetic as logic of sensible knowledge, were strangely addicted to applying logical categories to the new knowledge, talking of aesthetic concepts, aesthetic judgments, aesthetic syllogisms, and so on. We are less superstitious as regards the solidity of the traditional logic of the schools, and better informed as to the nature of aesthetic. We do not recommend the application of logic to aesthetic, but the liberation of logic from aesthetic forms. These have given rise to non-existent forms or categories of logic, due to the following of altogether arbitrary and crude distinctions. Logic, thus reformed, will always be formal logic. It will study the true form or activity of thought, the concept, excluding single and particular concepts. The old logic is ill called formal. It were better to call it verbal or formalistic. Formal logic will drive out formalistic logic. To attain this object, it will not be necessary to have recourse, as some have done, to a real or material logic, which is not a science of thought, but thought itself in the act, not only a logic, but the complex of philosophy, in which logic also is included. The science of thought, logic, is that of the concept, as that of fancy, aesthetic, is the science of expression. The well-being of both sciences lies in exactly following in every particular the distinction between the two domains. End of chapter 5. Recording by Lisa Reichert.